Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be here with you today on behalf of UN Women, which is the United Nations flagship entity working on gender equality and women's empowerment. And I'd like to start by thanking Phenix Capital Group for the invitation to share a few reflections in the course of the Impact Summit Europe 2022. And I'd like to focus my comments on the urgent need for investors to think about sustainability as being the core pillar of their investment strategies and why this is so essential going forward. So perhaps I will start with a bit of history and just tell you that I had the honor to meet Ban Ki-moon, who actually set up UN Women when he was the Secretary General of the United Nations. And the way he told me the story over dinner was that when he got to the United Nations, he looked around and he saw that there was an agency dealing with many of the world's problems. There was an agency for children, UNICEF. There was an agency for refugees, UNHCR, and others dealing with specific sectoral issues like trade and others. But there wasn't an agency to deal with the single most important problem that he thought remained to be solved, which was gender equality and women's empowerment. And that's why UN Women was set up. And what we have learned in our first decade of existence, we're 11 years old now, is that if you do not bring a gender lens to investment decisions, then we are missing out a huge opportunity to bring about change in the world very quickly. But what is even more essential today is not just to think about gender equality and women's empowerment, but the nexus between this and climate change, and to think about solutions and approaches that actually are win-win in that they solve for a set of issues rather than just one. So let me say why I think that the investment community, particularly private equity and venture capital funds, have an extraordinary opportunity to solve problems today and to bring about impact in everything that they do. I don't think I need to tell you that the world of 2020 faces a daunting array of challenges. And many of these challenges, particularly in markets which are fragile, conflict affected, and generally difficult, are problems that have the face of women, whether it is Afghanistan, Myanmar, Haiti, Ethiopia, and now most recently, as we look at the pictures of refugees fleeing, we are seeing pictures of women and children. So what does investment capital have to do with all of this? Well, we see a number of opportunities where investors and fund managers can play a really important role. First, we need to marry, as I said previously, gender and climate action, because they are actually inextricably linked to the promise of shared prosperity and change. The crisis in Ukraine is making everybody rethink energy security and energy policy. And we know that climate change affects all of us, but it actually affects women more than it affects other groups because they are often the most vulnerable and find it the hardest to escape from climate disasters. We know that 80% of women, of people who are displaced by climate change, are in fact women. And women do not have easy access to funds to cover weather-related losses or adaptation technologies. But also women as consumers, employees, business owners, suppliers, caregivers, and decision makers are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. And this means that they actually represent both a risk and an opportunity, because the business risks mean that companies' entire value chains can be impacted by not paying attention to women, including through the workforce and through local communities. The IMF has projected that failing to pay attention to women's empowerment means that countries stand to lose significant possible growth of GDP, as much as 10% in advanced economies to more than 30% in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. So there is scope for private equity funds to build climate resilience and women's empowerment in tandem. This would mean approaches that include and address the unique needs of women and that incorporate their knowledge, skills, and potential into solutions. For example, we at UN Women have been engaging quite heavily with a group of Nordic investors who create benefits for women through climate investments. And they can take the form, for example, of investing in biodiversity, in clean energy, and in funds that work with portfolio companies that enhance women's employment and leadership opportunities, because they have found that this often brings them much greater returns. Second, we need to reorient more financing towards sustainable investment and women's empowerment, because it is good business, aside from being the right thing to do. And these solutions will leverage private capital for impact at scale. If you look at venture capital and private equity, according to IFC, only 7% of investments in emerging markets are actually going to women-led companies. And this contrasts with the evidence that shows that investing in women actually yields a positive impact at the bottom line. And so we know, and there's plenty of empirical research now that shows that companies with more diverse boards and with senior management teams that reflect diversity actually have better environmental, social, and governance performance, including having core ethical business functions, enhanced workplace policies, and stronger community relations, being higher than they are in companies that do not have this level of diversity. We've also seen in evidence from BCG that women-owned startups actually generate 10% more in cumulative revenue than male-funded startups. So why then is there a continuation of a really important funding gap for women-run businesses? And we think this has to do with structural bias and long-held stereotypes that must be attacked. IFC research has pointed to structural biases even within investment teams. And we know that only 11% of senior investment professionals in emerging markets, private equity, and venture capital funds are women. So it also is related to the issue of women's representation and women's ability to drive decision-making. And we have evidence that when you have female partners, they actually invest in 2 times more female entrepreneurs than male partners. And most significantly, funds that are managed by gender-balanced teams outperform male or female-dominated teams with 20% higher returns. So there is a very strong business case and a growing business case for diversity, both within investment teams and portfolio companies. And it is good to know that the tide is turning, that the gender lens investment opportunity is increasing as growth in investors' interests is actually growing. And this is the third opportunity that I would like to highlight today. We know that ESG assets may hit, according to Bloomberg, almost 53 trillion by 2025, which will be then about a third of total assets globally under management. And according to Morgan Stanley, 2/3 of global asset managers actually consider diversity a key area of interest in their investment portfolio. Now, if investors are demanding this, why aren't fund managers actually listening and responding? And we think part of the reason is that data that we have, which shows the direction of venture capital and private equity, shows that although there has been a 250% growth in gender lens funds in the past 4 years, and gender bonds are growing, there is still a huge opportunity to do more. And one of the ways that we can incentivize the growth of a new asset class, for example, gender bonds, is to actually have guidelines that make it possible. So I'm very pleased to share that UN Women has worked together with IFC and the International Capital Markets Association to produce the world's first gender bond guidelines. And we are actually in discussions with a number of sovereigns as well as a number of corporates who are interested in issuing gender bonds. We think this is a real opportunity, and it will give robustness to gender lens investing, because, of course, what we do not want to see is gender lens investment being made in the name of gender, which is nothing more than pinkwashing. And in order to make sure that we are not pinkwashing, it is very important that there be a framework, that there be guidelines, and that is why we have invested heavily in working with partners to produce these guidelines. We also at UN Women have something called a set of women's empowerment principles, to which a number of major corporates are signatories. And there is a possibility that firms that have signed on to the women's empowerment principles can marry that focus on performance and marry that corporate intent to do better on gender with their corporate issuances. These are tools that can help companies advance equality in the workplace, in the marketplace, and in the community. I'm happy to say that we have more than 6,300 companies in over 150 countries who have signed the Women's Empowerment Principles. They provide data and analytics that business leaders can take to refine their approaches and to constantly improve. Our own research on the 50 largest companies in each of the G7 countries has found that companies that have adopted the WEPs actually do significantly better than companies that have not made this commitment. So I would ask you as investors to work with your portfolio companies to become WEP signatories. And the quality of the disclosures that these companies will make will actually help in ensuring that they are making the right investments, whether within their operations or within their supply chains and their business overall, to really drive home gender equality and, where possible, link it to the looming crisis of climate change. So let me conclude by just saying that gender equality is going to be something that we will see more and more attention to. It is going to occupy your agenda for years to come. So incorporating it smartly through use of existing tools, such as the Women's Empowerment Principles, through the use of guidelines, such as the Gender Bond Guidelines, will give you instruments that can help to accelerate this very important journey. This is not only good business, it is also important, because in the end, it is about building the kind of world that we all want to live in. Unfortunately, the challenges to gender equality remain very large. And our research shows that because of the setbacks that occurred during the pandemic, we have actually just increased the amount of time that the world is going to need to reach gender equality. Pre-pandemic, our estimates were globally that it would take about 99 years to reach gender equality. And now, because of the pandemic, we think it will be at least 140 years before we reach gender equality. So, ladies and gentlemen, gender equality is not something that we are going to see in our lifetimes. It is not something we're going to see in our daughters' lifetimes or our granddaughters' lifetimes, unless we act with a sense of urgency. With that, let me wish you excellent discussions and just remind you that there have been issues in the world that when we have come together as a global community, we have been able to solve. There are important problems that the world has solved through collective action. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an opportunity, and I urge you to seize it. Thank you.